Moving on to scheduling. The system-wide average, that's another question that people have had in relationship to scope. It used to say the average of all regular and secondary lines. We changed that language to say the weighted credit hour average of all bid pack average BLGs. So what have we done here? We basically removed secondary lines from this equation. Why is that important? Well, we all know that you can have carry-in and not include that in your BLG, and then they can't fill up your line totally. Well, they use that can't filled up total as the average in this average. So we were having secondary lines as low as like 9 credit hours added into our system-wide average. By removing those secondary lines, we increase the system-wide average by over an hour, sometimes up to 2 hours. The weighted credit hour average of all bid pack average BLGs, so we're taking the average of the average. It has to be weighted, otherwise Indianapolis has the same weight as Memphis. So it's weighted by the number of lines in each bid pack. So in practice, this is the same thing they were doing before, and it works out as an average of all regular lines. Base hotel standby. One of our openers was to totally remove base hotel standby. We were unable to do that. The company was unwilling to give this up totally, but we were able to come up with what we feel like is a pretty good solution in that base hotel standbys, all known base hotel standbys have to be included in the bid pack, just like trips. They can only be constructed during the bid pack process and during the secondary line process. After the secondary line process is done, they can make no more base hotel standbys. Now, once they're in open time, the company's allowed to do certain things. They can split 1 and 2, they can combine 2, but they can't move them. So if they're going to combine 2, they have to be butting up against each other. Or if they can split 1 into 2, but they have to leave them right where they are. So we put real restrictions on what they can do as far as revisions to those base hotel standbys. Scheduling-wise, they can put those base hotel standbys on and what is now an R16 line, but they can only use ones that already exist, ones that were built during the secondary line process. So we don't have situations now where they can say, oh, you're an R16 guy, we just want you to be in Memphis rather than be at home, so we're going to build you a base hotel standby and bring you into Memphis. They also can't do things like during COVID, when you had an international trip and something happened where you couldn't go out on that trip. I'm sure some of you had the experience where they took your whole trip and just made it a big line of base hotel standby, so you got to sit in Memphis. They can't do that anymore. They can't just build a base hotel standby to stick you in. If they didn't have one available there, then there's nothing for them to put you in. The other thing we did with base hotel standby has to do with pay. And right now in our current book, a base hotel standby, a day of base hotel standby pays an R-day value. The company has been paying us either the R-day value or the time away from base, but that's not actually what's in the contract. So we codified that to make sure that they continue that practice, which has the consequence of making base hotel standbys more expensive than sitting on reserve, since it's the higher of those two. It's never cheaper, it's more expensive in most cases for them to use base hotel standbys, which is another break on what the company can do. I mean, because I think we all agree that the company does try to manipulate language, but the one thing that we all agree is that if it makes financial sense to the company, if it saves them money, we can count on them doing that. So I mentioned R16, and that was part of this base hotel standby solution. And I know there's some questions on that and why that came to be. And the basic issue was the company said that on R24, if we come into a situation where we might need to use someone for the next morning's launch, we can't use R24. So in that case, we're just going to bring all those guys in and make them base hotel standbys, because then we can use them. So the R16 came into being because it does allow them during the assignment window. Now, the same rules apply to R16 that apply to R24, that they can assign them outside the window, but what they're worried about is in that window assigning the next day's trips. So inside that window, it starts at 10 o'clock, they can start assigning these trips from the next day, and 16 hours allows them to use an R16 for a trip that starts or shows at 2 o'clock or later. Still provides for a person that jump seats in to get a little bit of rest before he heads out on that trip. The company was looking for R14, which we felt was too short because you'd get in and you'd be headed right out on your trip if they actually held you to that 14 hours. So that's where the R16 came from. We understand that for some, R16 doesn't work where R24 did, but R24 wasn't working like it was supposed to be working. We feel like this is a true long-haul reserve, that they can't just arbitrarily put you on a base hotel standby. So we'll actually let people sit at home and sit reserve. Student lines. This was an area that the company pushed hard. They initially wanted to just be able to take the lines, a certain percentage of lines every month, and then they wanted to basically be able to force take the LCA's lines, or take captain's lines and give them to LCA's is actually if technically what they wanted to do. So we wanted to make this so that it affected the fewest people possible and that those affected actually got something out of this situation. So what we did was we limited the number of student lines to 40% of the LCA's who are bidding in a non-pay-only status. So what that works out to is 8 to 10 lines maximum for the larger Memphis bid packs. And the out bases, it's 1, maybe 2 up in Anchorage, depending. So we've limited this to those LCA lines. And they have to take lines that those LCA's bid. Our LCA's are not a uniform seniority. They're not all super senior. We have LCA's that run the gambit from junior to senior in every seat. So we felt like by tagging it to what the LCA's were actually bidding, what the LCA's were actually able to hold, we'll get a cross-section across the bid pack, and it won't always be the most senior trips that they have access to. We put one more limit on it, and that's you can't take the same LCA's line in consecutive months. The idea there is that if an LCA typically bids his home city, we don't want whoever's in that home city to constantly lose that line. We tried to come up with a way to tag it to the actual city, but you run into the problem there where the company could take a pure line and add one trip in it that was not at that city and say, well, it's not pure now, so it's not that city, so we're going to take it anyway. So we thought that the safest and easiest way to control for that was to tag it to what the LCA's are actually bidding and make sure that they can't take those lines. Because those LCA's are going to have vacation, they've got pay-only bid months, so they're not going to be, it's not going to be every month in any given city. Once the bid comes out and the LCA's have made their bids, then the training scheduling gets to decide which lines to take. So from all the LCA's that bid, they can go through and they can pick up to 40% depending on what they need. And then those student lines will be published so the FOs can take a look at them. And they can decide if they still want to have that on their bid or not. Or there is an option where FOs can opt out of student lines altogether. And if they do that, then when a student line is on their bid and they would have been awarded a student line, then it'll just move to their next bid like someone else had gotten that bid. So they would get the next bid on their, or the next line on their bid. Now these student lines will get awarded. So if they were to happen to go all the way to the bottom of the list, then they would be assigned to the last pilots on the list. But if you think about it logically, suppose you're a guy that can hold the number 1 secondary line. So you would have gone in the secondary line process and picked trips out of open time. With a training line, you bid the training line, your trips are dropped, and you go into the view add window and you do the same thing, but you do it ahead of all the secondary lines. So I don't see any scenario where you would have this drop further than secondary lines because it actually puts these guys ahead of wherever the secondary lines are. And the other part of this is that once those trips are dropped and you pick them up, there's 125% premium on those trips. So I already kind of went through it a little bit, but after the conflict window is processed, so all of your vacation drops, your training drops, your min days off drops, those will all take place first. Then the remaining hours will be dropped and you'll be awarded SMU hours. Those hours are paid at 125%. You're eligible to pick those trips up in the view add window. You can go into the view add window only in the month that those are awarded. Following that month, you can still use them. They don't go away. They still have a 125% premium. They do not have a priority, but you can use them like you would use your normal makeup. And those hours don't go away, like I said. You pick them up as a first officer, you decide to fly them as a captain, you get 125% of captain's pay. We haven't changed any of the rules about bump for training. If for some reason you get a training or a student line and you get bumped off and then you pick up a trip in open time and get bumped off that trip, for training, you get to stay home for 125%. The other 60% of the LCA lines, if they need those lines for ad hoc or something else, you get bumped off that, you stay home, you get paid 100%. So we haven't changed anything to do with actually getting bumped for training. We feel like this is actually can be a scheduling tool that people will use. You can clear your schedule if you want to do that. A lot of times when we're doing a lot of training, there's draft and volunteer to be had. During this last COVID, people were trying to clear their schedules using, the secondary, the snapshots, or using carry-in. This would allow you to clear your schedule and fly as much draft or volunteer as you want on that empty schedule at 150%. And then when you decide to go back and make up these trips, you get paid 125% for those. We have a lot of guys that at the end of the month, they get a trash line and they dump the whole thing and try to rebuild in open time. You can do the same thing with this, only everything's at 125%. We have guys that are reserve guys that take their whole reserve block and drop their training on top of it just to get into the view ad window. They can get a training line and go into the view ad window and pick up trips at 125%. Been some questions about what this is going to do to secondary lines. Well, in practice, what the company does is they try to build enough secondary lines to fill up all the trips that are left in open time. So this will probably reduce the number of secondary lines because they know that these guys are going to go pick up some of those trips. So I don't see that there's no way to tell exactly what's going to happen because we don't know that these guys are going to go pick up all these trips. We don't know how the company's going to react to that. But the supposition would be that there would end up being fewer secondary lines. Revisions were a big issue during COVID, so we tried to address some of those issues. The company was resistant to anything that reduces their ability to make revisions, so we just tried to make them pay for it. We went through a whole lot of iterations of 150% for every revision. We weren't able to accomplish that, but we did get these extra disruptions put in. The first extra landing is now an hour and a half instead of half an hour, and then everyone after that remains at an hour and a half. We did get a layover change disruption to kind of try to cover some of these mass changes of every layover on your trip. It doesn't seem like a big change to go from greater than 50% to 50% or greater. That's the change here. But that actually makes it hit 4 times as much. Cost the company 3 times as much. And we doubled the penalty for doing that to 3 credit hours from an hour and a half. The 75% or greater is just an acknowledgement if they change even more than that, so your trip is nothing like it started out to be, then you would get 4 credit hours. You only get one or the other. It's not cumulative. It's not 7 total. It's either 3 or 4. We were able to add a day to critical disruption. So if you've got a trip where more than half of the duty periods are day duty periods, and they revise your trip so that more than half of your duty periods touch the critical period at any point, then you would get 3 credit hours. We were able to add the deadhead at the beginning of a trip. So if you have a deadhead at the beginning of the trip and they take it away, now you have to operate, you get a duty period disruption. And that doesn't keep you from receiving other disruptions in that duty period, just as the end deadhead doesn't now. I did want to mention the 4GG and 4HH changes. We've had a lot of questions about those. Those critical pay period events, there's some language added in there about only during domestic trips. The reason for that is that there is no critical period for international trips. So it's just a clarification for pilots to understand that there is no critical period on international trips, so there's no way that you could get one of these pay events on an international trip. One other thing I did want to add is, and we did get this question just the other day, those SMU credit hours, they're in a makeup bank just like a general makeup bank. You have guarantee on those, so those hours are also eligible for disruptions. It's actually our only pay code that has a premium that's eligible for disruptions. The AVA, on the last one for any of you here, we had the big eye chart. The company came in, and what they wanted to do was change AVA, draft, and volunteer all to have to fly min bid period guarantee before you get any premium. We were able to reduce this to just AVA. It's something that's not available that often. It's something that you can choose to play in this game or not. If you don't think that you're going to have or meet one of the requirements, then you can just get normal draft or volunteer and still get paid 150%. But if AVA does work for you, Basically what happens is they take 2 snapshots. One snapshot at the beginning of the month, and that one is just either when you get awarded your line, or actually when the view add window closes, or when your secondary line is awarded. They look at your line and say, do you meet min-bid period guarantee at that point? That's the first hurdle. If you pass that hurdle, then at the end of the month, they look at what you actually flew. They look at your earned credit hours that are not AVA. Earned credit hours, there's a list in the document about everything that's not earned credit hours, because it's easier to list the things that aren't than the things that are. But an easy way to think about it is anything that's going to show up on your calendar counts as an earned credit hour. Anything that you're going to get paid for. So if you get PDO bumped off something, those hours count. If you use your vacation, those hours count. If you're sick, those hours count. So at the end of the month, they take a look and they say, okay, your earned credit hours except for your AVA was greater than mid-bid period guarantee, then every AVA credit hour is paid at 175%. If you meet the first snapshot, so you started out with enough credit hours and at the end of the month you don't have enough, then they use your AVA credit hours to get you up to min-bid period guarantee, and then you get 150% for everyone after that. And then on the other side of the equation is if you don't meet that first requirement. So you start out with less than a min-bid period guarantee. If at the end of the month you are over min-bid period guarantee, then all of your AVA hours will be paid at 150%, just like draft or volunteer now. If you're under that min-bid period guarantee, then you get 100% up to that number, and then 150% above that. And for anybody that doesn't remember, the min-bid period guarantees are 68 credit hours in a 4-week bid month, 85 credit hours in a 5-week bid month. One of the other things we aimed at getting was first fly preferencing. And basically, or actually preferencing on reserve was the goal. What we were able to accomplish is a more robust first fly system so that people on reserve can look at what's in open time or say, I want to go on first fly, I want to fly, but I only want to fly if it's this, if it's double deadheads to the West Coast, or if it's day flying, or if it's whatever. You can put in a request just like a general makeup request, or you can put in a specific trip request. If the trip is less than 60 hours time away from base, then those will be awarded in seniority order. If it's more than 60 hours time away from base, it will be given a priority, but the company still has the option, if they're short on reserves, to use a best fit. The open time notification system and the draft notification system are both kind of playing on the same idea that we're all carrying around communication devices in our pockets. When we are constantly polling open time, and you got a bunch of people polling open time, we end up with situations with the open time drop where it takes hours and hours, you can't get in. So we were trying to alleviate some of that and some of the need for people to be constantly doing that, polling open time. The way this will work is you can give the company a phone number, you can give them a list of requirements for open time trips that you would like. If one of those drops into open time, you'll get a text, and then you can go in and try to pick up that trip in VIPs. Now there's still some discussion with the company on what that information you will get will be, whether it's just, hey, there's a trip you might want, or if it's going to be, here's the trip. We don't have that information yet, but we have to work with the company to develop exactly what that looks like. The draft notification system, like I said, works on kind of the same system. You give them a number for a text. When a draft trip comes up, they send out a blast text to everybody that said that they're eligible for draft. And then it depends on how long it is before showtime as to how that will be played out. If it's more than 4 hours from showtime, the company will leave it open for 15 minutes. And then when 15 minutes is over, they'll close the draft window, and they'll look at all those, and they will award the draft trip to the pilot who has had the fewest draft hours in the last 6 months. Makes it a lot more transparent for us determining what's happening with draft. If it's a tie, then it goes to the senior pilot. If it's less than 4 hours from showtime, then it's fastest finger. Whoever replies first will be awarded the draft trip. Moving on to Section 5, traveling expenses. Starting out with per diem. As Pat mentioned earlier, we tried to set everything to a fire and forget in this contract. We had a plan for per diem that we were pretty proud of, and it was attached to a CPI-U number. And every time that went up, our per diem went up, so we got an adjustment every year. The company is always loath to do anything they don't have control over. It's one of the big issues we have or one of the big issues they have with control. So in the end, we were able to just accomplish these increases. Domestic was increased to 265 a day to signing, and international to 365. That 265 number on domestic, we had higher, and we fought hard to make that higher. The company pointed out that 265 gets you to just under $64 in a day, which is the max tax-free number for most of the places that we go domestically. So it didn't make a whole lot of sense to just create taxable income so we're only getting 30 or 40%, or the government's getting 30 or 40% of our per diem payments. So we settled on 265 as that number. On the first day of the June 2025 bid month, the domestic goes up to 285, international goes up to 385. There's a new expense report discrepancy notification system, and this has to do with the fact that the company has taken so long to close our expense reports right now. I think my oldest expense report is September at this point from last year. And we've had a lot of experiences with them coming back way after it closed and way after the window closed for supplying a receipt and say, you missed a receipt, so now you got to pay us back for whatever the expense was, on the order of thousands of dollars for some of our pilots. So what we did is we created a system here with 3 different notifications, 7 days apart for the first 2, and then you have 14 days after the last one to solve the problem. They're going to be more specific on exactly what's missing, which receipt it is, how much it's for, and then it'll give you when that period ends. And the 7 days, and 14 days that you get are not dependent on that receipt limit that we have right now. Whenever they get to you and ask you for this, you will have those limits. So there should be no more cases where you are prevented from fixing a situation, or from where they give you, hey, one of your receipts is missing, and you had 40 receipts and you don't know which ones, so you're trying to put them all in. This should make that problem less. Unfortunately, we were unable to come up with a system that actually required them to fix the expense report system. That has in large part to do with their manning. They have 5 people in their expense report division for the entire company that know how to do pilot expense reports, and they are not dedicated to pilots. You can see where the problem is there. And until they fix that problem, I don't see our expense report system getting better on that end, but at least this keeps them from taking our money for things that we can fix. We got a new joint hotel criteria list that's developed between ALPA and the company. We were able to add some items to that list that weren't previously on it: quiet, safe, secure, and in-room environmental controls. Those are all big issues during COVID. Those are all going to be on the hotel criteria list. We didn't make it a must-have list because we trust our hotel services committee to go in and look at these hotels, and we all know there are some cases where we still want to be in that hotel even though it doesn't have something on the list. Now, safe, secure, we obviously all want all those, but there's high-speed internet, a gym, and that kind of stuff that maybe we're willing to go without if the hotel's in the right location. So we wanted to give our hotel services committee some leeway to pick what they thought was the best hotel for us in these different locations. Once they pick those hotels, they'll all go on a new approved hotel list. And this approved hotel list is a list of all the hotels that FedEx is able to use. Not just the one they're scheduling to, but all of the hotels they're allowed to use in a certain city. They're not allowed to use a hotel that's not on this list, that hasn't been vetted through the joint hotel criteria list, unless every room at that hotel is full. And there's literally no way they can get you in one of the approved hotels. We changed some of the limits on the dispute process, where we actually have set limits now, where it used to say a reasonable time. Now it's 15 days for them to get back to us. So we're hoping that solves some of the issues that we've had with them delaying fixes for these hotels. And then the last thing is, if we still have a dispute with the company at the end of that process, we were able to attach a new designation, a hotel of concern, and that will be on the approved hotel list, so pilots will know that there's a problem with this hotel for bidding. It also makes it so that hotel has to be addressed at every quarterly meeting. The company has to come tell us what they're doing to fix that problem until it's fixed. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but the company was extremely concerned about how to get those hotels off this list. The last one, pilots are not required to provide a receipt folio with the pilot's expense report. If you read the language, and we've had some questions about this, It does talk about the company will provide the pilot with a way to get the hotel to send this in, and it seems really circuitous and kind of funky language. The reason for that is basically for pilots' privacy. We want to make sure that the hotel is not sending something to the company about your expenses, whatever you put, maybe what you put on your personal card, or maybe an expense from your personal card got put on the company card by accident. So we want you guys to have control over your private information. That's why that language is in there, and they're still working on how that's gonna play out. Vacation. We didn't open this. Obviously, we had some trepidation about what the company wanted here. We were able to get 100% buyback on our vacation. We know that some people disagree with this and say that, well, this is a productivity issue, but in our view, vacation belongs to the pilot. The money's yours. You should have the choice. And the other reason that we wanted this was that every year we have pilots that, through whatever scheduling problem or whatever, they give vacation hours back to the company. We don't want that to ever happen. Those vacation hours are yours, and forfeiting them to the company is unacceptable. This provision makes sure that no one will ever forfeit any vacation hours again. The other thing the company wanted, and this was a COVID-era problem, they were very concerned about people selling their vacation back and not working. That was their issue that they pointed out to us. So we went back and looked and said, how often does this really happen? And they said, we don't know. I said, well, can you give us the data? So they gave us the data, and we looked at it. We went all the way back to 2016 to see how many people had sold back vacation and not flown at all. Any guesses on the number? 17. And some of those were guys that had gone out on mill leave or emergency leave after the bid period started. The total number that could have flown and did not fly was 11. This is the problem the company wanted to fix. So we're like, okay, well, let's look and see how many people this would actually affect. So we went back and looked at what everybody did fly. 90% of our pilots flew more than bid period guarantee. The average number of hours that a pilot flew in a 4-week bid month was greater than 89 hours. In a 5-week bid month, it was greater than 109 hours. Our pilots aren't sitting at home and not flying. 93% of our pilots flew within 6 hours of min bid period guarantee. So they either flew 79 or 62, depending on a 4 or 5-week bid month. So we looked at this and said, this is a voluntary thing. Nobody has to do this. It fits in with our requirements of things that we're trying to help or trying to do with the company, where we want pilots to be in control. If you go back through and you look at the places we've changed, a pilot has an option on all of these things. We tried to leave control in your hands. So we decided to work with them on this and allow them to require a mid-bid period guarantee before you receive the 24 credit hour premium. But this doesn't affect you in the month prior. It doesn't affect you in the month after. If you combine this with a training line, you sell your vacation back, you work that month, you bid a training line the next month, you don't work the next month, and then when you go make all that up, you make 125%. We think we've given you some good tools. Are they all total wins? No, it's obviously better to get to sit at home and get paid. But this was a way that we could provide value on that thing that the company was pushing hard on getting. And the other thing that we were able to accomplish in vacation was involuntary buyback, increasing that amount. Currently, it's the same premium, that same 24-hour premium if you volunteer to do it or if they force you to do it. That's not right. I think we can all see that. The worst possible outcome is for guys to get their vacation involuntarily taken. So what we did there is the company, during negotiations, had a situation where they thought they were going to do an involuntary buyback, and we asked them to ask twice before they did that. So when they asked for volunteers, they didn't get enough. They asked again, and they did get enough. So we codified that in the contract. They have to ask at least twice for volunteers before they do an involuntary buyback. The premium was increased to 36 credit hours. If they take your vacation, instead of 24, it's 36 credit hours. And oh yeah, by the way, if they take your vacation and you get your 36 credit hours, now you don't have to fly. Section 8. Opportunity for seat selection. We've all seen the low accepted fares that they put in there. You see $100 fares. Our concern was that they were going to move to these basic economy fares, that you have to pay for a seat, you pay for your bags, you pay for everything, and that's how they were getting these low fares. They gave us the data on this, and basically the times when your ticket is less, significantly less than what the baseline or established fare is, they're high impact but low occurring events. If you look at the graph, when we looked at 37,000 Deadhead tickets, and the graph on how tight the baseline and established fares were to what they actually paid, it basically goes like this. It spikes up in the middle. The tails are really long. And like I said, it's high impact, but it's low occurring. But we were able to do this so that the company has to buy a ticket that allows you for seat selection. So it should keep you at worst in the main cabin. And this also allowed us to codify the Southwest business as being the seat selection. So we'll always get that business class if they decide to use Southwest. Next thing we looked at was deviation bank improvements. For those that haven't been here long enough, what we have in the contract right now is at the end of the month, they use your deviation bank. You can use it for the previous month, but then it gets cut in half. It gets cut in half again every month. So what we did here is we maintained our deviation bank in total for 3 bid periods. In the 4th bid period, it's reduced in half. The 5th bid period, it goes to 0. Now, the 5th bid period under our current system, your deviation bank would be 1/32nd of what you originally started with. So if you started with $1,000, you'd have like $31.25 left, somewhere around that. So that going to 0 in that 5th bid period, there wasn't much money left on the current system anyway, and this gives you access to that money for a longer period of time. We also codified in here that the money's first in, first out, so they can't use your money that you had this month and use all that up and then the other money went away because it was in the 4th month. They have to use that earliest money first. So how's this going to work with a travel MOU? You know, we've been under this MOU since COVID where you're keeping your deviation bank at 100% in perpetuity. Well, there's a 7-day opt-out on that. And I think Marty put in the SIG notes a few months back that they're not using company jump seats for deadheads anymore. So you can imagine they're starting to look at getting out of that. Well, when they get out of that, we get 4 months of 100%. And then the contract jumps back in. So you get 4 months at 100%, and then 3 more months at 100% under this. And then that 8th month, it will go to 50%, and the 9th month, it will go to 0. So you'll have 3/4 of a year basically to get use of that money before that money goes away. Another thing we were able to keep from the travel MOU was rental cars, which I know that a lot of people are using those for places that are close. Sometimes it's a lot easier to just rent a car and drive over than to play at the airport. Seat selection fees, we used to be complicated on $40 per segment versus $80 per flight, and there was a lot of confusion on this. We got rid of all those restrictions and just said, look, it's $100. So we got a little bit of an increase, took away the restrictions on it. You can use it all on one leg. You can use it split up, but it's $100 for each instance of a deadhead. Hotel base during the sub window. This was one of our goals. We initially had some buy-in from the company on them getting us a hotel in the sub window, but they put one extra requirement on it. They said, if you take the hotel, you have to take the sub trip. Right. We said, no thanks. Trying to keep those choices in the hands of pilots. That's the one part of sub that's not bad, is that you can actually turn them down if they offer you something that you don't like, you don't want. But what we were able to do here is hotels in base during the sub are an allowable reimbursable expense. So you can use your bank money, you can use your hotel money to get yourself a hotel if you want to stay in base. It is subject to all the same rules though, so it is subject to the contract rate. And the last one is no receipts for expenses less than $75. Should help with expense report some. That's the IRS maximum right now. So why that says the IRS maximum, whichever is less. If the IRS were to reduce that limit, then this obviously wouldn't hold. But for right now, it's $75 instead of the $25 that we currently have. Hours of service. We had a problem with our fatigue calls. And it basically had to do with people that had a series of one-day trips. So what would happen is somebody calls in fatigued out in the field. The current rules say that he's returned from sick as soon as his trip ends. So his next trip remains intact. So now he's out in the field. He probably got in late. He's got to get rest and then figure out how to get himself home, and he's still on that next trip the next day. So the fatigue just continues to mount. So what we've done here is we said that you're not returned from the fatigue call until 24 hours after you call in. And what that does is that knocks out the next day's trip. So you can get yourself home, that next trip's not there, and then the next day you would pick up your trips. You always have the option of calling in fatigued on that second trip. That's not taken away, but we feel like this is a better solution for guys so they can actually catch up from their fatigue and then get back and pick up their trips. Base hotel standby again. This is actually where all the base hotel standby language is. We talked about it in 4 and 25, but this is where the language lives. And one of the things that a lot of people didn't understand about base hotel standby is that when you're assigned a trip on base hotel standby, there is no limit to how long it can be in the current language. And it doesn't matter if you were on reserve and they gave you a base hotel standby, or if you got it in your bid. It doesn't matter. If you're on the last day of a 4-day base hotel standby, they can assign you a 12-day trip. And the only overage you would get on that is after the 12-day trip. If it goes over the 12 days, you get paid overage on that. Well, obviously, that's not what we want. We were able to get in here and put basically the same limits as trips, since now base hotel standbys are going to be treated more like trips. They got to be in the bid pack. There's a whole bunch more rules on that. So 36 hours for a domestic trip, 84 hours for an international trip is the longest they can keep you out on that hotel standby. And that actually is at the end of the trip that's assigned. The 8 and 24 exception trips right now, there's no way for pilots or schedulers to know what may or may not have started as an 8 and 24 trip. So when they revise them, they are touching the critical period, which is not allowed for this exception. So we were able to get the company to designate these both in VIPs and in the bid pack that these are 8 and 24 trips. So pilots and scheduling can make sure that the rules are properly followed. The one other thing that happened with these 8 and 24 trips is the SIG came to us and they said that there were opportunities to make some of these trips better on the back end, but it's actually less than a 13-hour rest. It's a better hook city, a better overall product. So they wanted the ability to go less than 13 hours. We didn't want to give the company any room to use that just for anything, so it's still a 13-hour limit for scheduling unless the SIG approves it to be scheduled for 12 hours. So we kind of gave our guys the hammer to say, hey, this would make sense. This is a good trip, good for our pilots. We can go down to 12. The corollary to that was that operationally it can be reduced to 11 hours. The programming for the company doesn't allow for a 13 and 12 and then a 12 and 11. There's an operational limit and a scheduling limit. And those are on 2 different computer systems. And so the limit operationally has been reduced to 11 hours. For our domestic rest provisions, we were able to increase those rest provisions from 9 to 9.5 hours, and the operational restriction was increased from 8 to 9. This puts us in better line with 117. 117 doesn't include our half an hour after block-in, so that 9:30 is essentially the 117 10 hours. And then we were able to get an extra hour if it's reduced for any reason, so that the minimum operationally is now 9 hours. For a duty period or a deadhead only duty period, we increased from 8 to 8.5 hours, both operationally and scheduled. There's no ability for them to reduce that because there's really no need for them to do that. Mediation LOA. Basically, this is a letter of agreement in the openers. It had to do with Section 21. It created a new mediation process. I am not an expert in the mediation process, but there is a podcast on the TA website that delves into this, and if you're interested, you can go and listen to that podcast and get as much information as you ever wanted to know on mediation and the Mediation LOA. 26. Our definition of flight data had not been updated since 1999. We were able to go in, the company wanted to go in and use more flight data because obviously since 1999 there's a lot more data that's coming off the airplane. And I think we all can see where some of that data helps with safety. It can definitely help with reliability. So there are reasons that we want to let the company use some of these things as long as they use it responsibly. So what we were able to do is update and improve our definition of flight data to include everything coming off the airplane and anything that they use that data for. Reports, graphs, anything that they use that data for is also considered flight data. The one exception is ACARS messages. So ACARS messages are not included in flight data. And in addition to that, we improved the flight data protections. All of those things that are included in flight data cannot be used for training, for discipline, for medical. They can't be used for those things. In return, the company can utilize that information for more things. Because what do we really care about? We care about our data and our protection versus the company using this data against us. So we've allowed them to use the data, but improve the protections, including one new prohibition about video recordings and still images of pilots, cameras in the cockpit. We never had a prohibition against that. We have one now. I know that for people that have been watching the news, the FAA Reauthorization Act does have something about cameras in it. I haven't read it. I don't know what it says. I don't know if it's mandatory. If that comes into law, then obviously we'll have to revisit this. But for now, we have a new restriction that we've never had before. Section 26 also says that the CBAs will only be electronic now unless you go in and ask for one. Anybody on property can go in and ask for a printed copy and they won't send you one. But unless you ask for one, it'll just be electronic. And then passports. This looks like something that we wouldn't want, but I think anybody that does international trips knows that a lot of these countries out here requires 8 months, or not 8 months, I'm sorry, requires 6 months on your passport to get into the country. Currently, we only have a warning at 30 days to redo your passport, so you could get out on a trip and find yourself in trouble if you're not paying attention. This 200 days prior will ensure that everybody's capable of getting into the countries that we operate into and not getting stuck out on a trip or removed from a trip because their passport doesn't allow them to go. Duration, this I think Pat talked about it a little bit earlier, but this was a big issue in this contract. The company wanted 6 years again, and they wanted 5 years. We obviously were fighting for a shorter amount of time. The MEC told us that was an important piece, and we were able to get them down to 4.5 years with a 150-day early opener. So we're opening our next negotiations at 4 years and 1 month. So with the effective date of this agreement at July 31st, 2023, that's the first day of the August bid month. The amendable date would be the first day of February 2028, but we'd be in openers 150 days prior, which is the 2nd of September 2027. So letters of agreement that are attached. First one's the implementation and transition LOA. There's 4 phases to it. DOS, then the first day of December 2023, first day of August 2024, and the first day of November 2024. So everything in this contract will be implemented by November of 2024. There are no TBDs in this implementation. Everything will be implemented. And you can go in and look at that. It has every single change that we made and when that will be implemented is in this letter of agreement. Minimal recovery payments. Ours applies from November 2nd of 2021 through July 30th of 2023. For each month that you are an active captain, 1 day in the month, you get $1,450. First officer gets $950 per bid period. The maximum for a captain, if you're a captain the whole time, is $30,450, and a first officer is $19,950. It's paid in cash, and it's pensionable and eligible for PRSP contributions. It's going to be distributed no later than the 15th of October. We've had a lot of people talking about what Delta and American got on theirs. They broke theirs up a little bit differently as they based it on what people made. We felt like that for our crew force, with the pain that everybody went through, we would spread this money out a little bit more. So we only have 2 designations, one for captains, one for first officers. And if you look at the amount of time that Delta was in negotiations, 36 months, and you take the amount that they say that their amendable period recovery was, they call it something different, I'm not sure what they called theirs, but $700 billion, the biggest one ever. But if you divide that out among 15,000 pilots for 36 months, their payment runs out to $1,296 a month, and it's non-pensionable. Our payment, if you take the average of the captain and the FO, is $1,200 a month, but it is pensionable. If you add that extra 9% to it, it's $1,308 a month. So we're roughly in the same ballpark as Delta and American as far as on a per pilot per month basis for the amendable period recovery payment.